Welcome, dream seekers and insomniacs. I'm your host, the Night Weaver, guiding you through soul-seeping, mind-haunting stories under a rain-soaked darkness. Now, take a deep breath, let the rhythm of the rain settle you, and follow me into the shadows beyond. The idea had been to disconnect, a weekend of no screens, no distractions, just the three of them in the quiet embrace of nature. Charlie had suggested it, convinced that unplugging would somehow bridge the growing chasm between them. He'd watched over the past year as his family had slowly drifted apart, each of them retreating into their own digital worlds. Julia spent her evenings scrolling through social media, while their teenage daughter, Tessa, seemed to exist primarily behind her bedroom door, the soft glow of her phone illuminating her face late into the night. A little time in the great outdoors never hurt anyone, he'd insisted during their family dinner, his voice carrying more optimism than he felt. Julia had exchanged a knowing look with Tessa, their skepticism evident in their shared glance. His wife had been hesitant, citing reasonable concerns about their daughter's resistance to camping, the weather forecast, and the remote location. But Charlie held firm, clinging to the belief that this weekend could be the reset they desperately needed. The drive to the campground had been tense, filled with Tessa's pointed sighs and Julia's nervous fidgeting. They wound their way through increasingly narrow roads, the ancient trees pressing closer with each passing mile. These weren't the manicured forests of state parks or popular camping destinations. These were old growth giants, their massive trunks scarred by centuries of winters, their branches reaching across the road like gnarled fingers scraping against the car's roof. Charlie had specifically chosen this spot for its isolation, having discovered it through an obscure camping forum. Pristine wilderness, the post had promised, far from the tourist trails. Now, as they followed the deteriorating dirt road deeper into the forest, that isolation felt less like an advantage and more like a warning. They arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already beginning its descent behind the towering trees. The shadows seemed to pulse with each breeze, creating an unsettling dance of light and darkness across their chosen campsite. Charlie tried to ignore the way the forest seemed to close in around them, forming a natural amphitheater that made him feel as if they were being watched from all sides. Tessa stood beside their packed car, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her eyes darting between the dense undergrowth that surrounded them. "This place feels wrong," she muttered. But Charlie pretended not to hear, busying himself with unloading their gear. Julia gave their daughter a reassuring smile, but Charlie caught the tremor in her hands as she helped him unpack. Setting up camp became an exercise in forced cheerfulness. Charlie maintained a steady stream of dad jokes and camping anecdotes, trying to lift the heavy atmosphere that had settled over them like a shroud. The tent went up with minimal struggle, though Charlie couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching their every move, studying them with ancient, patient eyes. As twilight crept in, they gathered around the campfire, its warm light creating a small circle of comfort in the growing darkness. Charlie had always loved this time of day while camping. The way the fire's glow seemed to create a barrier between civilization and wilderness, between the known and unknown. But tonight, that barrier felt frighteningly thin. "It's quiet out here, isn't it?" Julia's voice barely carried over the crackling flames, as if she were afraid to disturb whatever lurked in the darkness beyond their circle of light. The absence of natural sounds was becoming increasingly noticeable. No crickets chirping their evening symphony, no owls calling into the night, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Charlie forced a casual shrug, though his skin prickled with unease. "It's just nature, honey. We're not used to it, that's all." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them, a parent's reflexive reassurance that failed to convince anyone, least of all himself. The silence grew heavier as the night deepened, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Tessa had given up any pretense of enjoying herself, sitting so close to Julia that she might as well have been in her lap. Her eyes never stopped moving, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight with an intensity that made Charlie's stomach clench. When Julia finally suggested they turn in for the night, the relief in her voice was palpable. They hurried through their bedtime routine, the simple act of brushing teeth taking on an almost ritualistic significance, as if maintaining these normal, civilized behaviors could somehow ward off the oppressive wrongness that surrounded them. Inside the tent, they lay close together, their breathing synchronized in the darkness. Charlie stayed awake, listening to the unnatural quiet, his mind racing with possibilities he didn't want to acknowledge. He told himself it was just the stress of being away from civilization, the natural anxiety that came with being somewhere unfamiliar. But deep down, in that primitive part of his brain that remembered when humans were prey, he knew something was very wrong. The giggling started just after midnight. It came drifting through the trees like smoke, high-pitched and eerily playful, carrying with it an innocence that felt fundamentally wrong in this dark place. Charlie's eyes snapped open, his heart thundering against his ribs. He lay perfectly still, straining to convince himself he'd imagined it. But then it came again, closer this time, accompanied by the soft crunch of leaves under bare feet. With trembling hands, he unzipped the tent and crawled out into the night. The remains of their fire cast a dim red glow that did little to penetrate the darkness. The air felt thick, almost solid, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. And there, in the soft dirt around their tent, were the footprints, small, bare, human feet that had circled their shelter while they lay inside, vulnerable and unaware. Charlie's mind refused to process what he was seeing. They were miles from anywhere, deep in a forest that rarely saw visitors. There couldn't be children out here, not at this hour, not in this place. Yet the evidence was there, pressed into the earth like accusations, the tracks winding through their campsite before disappearing into the impenetrable darkness of the forest. He woke Julia with a gentle shake, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's someone out there. Kids, I think." The words felt absurd even as he spoke them, but Julia's eyes went wide with understanding, her hand clutching his arm with desperate strength. "Charlie, that doesn't make any sense," she breathed, but he could see in her face that she believed him. They both knew, on some fundamental level, that they had stumbled into something ancient and wrong, something that had been waiting in these woods for a very long time. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and vigilance. They huddled together, listening to the sounds that drifted through the darkness, giggling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the soft patter of bare feet on earth, and sometimes, most terrifying of all, the sound of children whispering in voices that were almost, but not quite, human. Morning brought no relief. The footprints had vanished, the ground around their tent smooth and undisturbed, as if the night's events had been nothing more than a shared nightmare. But the hollow-eyed exhaustion on Tessa's face told a different story. She hadn't slept, hadn't even closed her eyes, her body rigid with fear throughout the long night. They set out to explore the forest, partly because staying in camp felt impossible, and partly because Charlie desperately needed to convince himself that there was a rational explanation for what they'd experienced. The trail they followed was narrow and overgrown, winding deeper into the ancient forest like a thread through a labyrinth. The air grew thicker as they walked, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that made their heads swim. Tessa stayed between her parents, her usual teenage independence forgotten in the face of primal fear. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made her jump, her eyes wide and searching. It was Julia who spotted the first doll, hanging from a low branch like a grotesque fruit. The crude figure swayed gently in the non-existent breeze, its body fashioned from twisted twigs and leaves, its head a knot of forest debris that somehow managed to suggest features. Empty eyes, a gaping mouth, an expression of perpetual surprise. What is that? Julia's whisper carried a note of horror that made Charlie's skin crawl. He tried to dismiss it, to find some rational explanation, but the words stuck in his throat. The doll radiated wrongness, an aura of malevolent purpose that defied explanation. Julia reached up with trembling hands and took it down, holding it as if it might come alive in her grasp. The craftsmanship was primitive but deliberate, each twist and knot placed with obvious intent. It wasn't the work of children playing in the woods. It was something else, something that understood the power of symbols and terror. Their return to camp was marked by silence and growing dread. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing closer, their branches reaching down like hungry fingers. As darkness fell, they huddled around a fresh fire, though its light brought little comfort. The doll lay between them, a silent reminder that they were not alone in these woods. The giggling started earlier this time, as if whatever was out there had grown bolder, more confident. It circled their camp, drawing closer with each pass, accompanied by the soft padding of bare feet on earth. Tessa's cry of fear shattered the night, her fingers digging into Julia's arm hard enough to leave marks. Charlie grabbed the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. At first, there was nothing, just trees and shadows, playing tricks on their frightened minds. But then, as the light swept past a massive oak, they saw them. They were children, or something that had once been children. Half a dozen pale faces stared back at them from the darkness, their eyes reflecting the firelight like animals. Their clothes hung in tatters, their hair a mass of twigs and leaves, their skin smeared with earth and something darker, something that gleamed wetly in the firelight. They didn't move, didn't speak, just watched with an unnatural stillness that spoke of predators studying prey. Their faces held no expression, no hint of humanity or emotion, just an ancient, patient hunger that had nothing to do with food. Charlie tried to speak, to challenge these impossible creatures, but his voice failed him. The air grew thick with the sweet, rotting smell they'd noticed earlier, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. And then, between one breath and the next, the children were gone, melting back into the shadows, as if they'd never been there at all. The family spent the rest of the night in a tight circle around the fire, feeding it constantly, desperately trying to keep the darkness at bay. They spoke in whispers, sharing theories that grew more fantastic and terrifying with each passing hour. Were these lost children? Spirits? Something else entirely? Something that had never been human at all? Dawn brought no answers, but it did bring the dolls. They were everywhere, scattered around the campsite like fallen leaves, dozens of them, each unique, each twisted into positions that suggested agony or ecstasy or both. They had appeared silently, while the family huddled by their fire, too afraid to look into the darkness. Charlie picked one up, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. The doll seemed to pulse in his grasp, as if something lived inside its crude form, something that recognized him. Each figure was different, but they all shared the same basic form. Twisted limbs, hollow eyes, faces frozen in eternal screams. "Charlie, we need to leave." Julia's voice cracked with fear, and for once he didn't argue. They packed their gear in record time, leaving the dolls where they lay, too afraid to touch them more than necessary. But as they turned to leave, the giggling started again, closer than ever, filled with a terrible joy that made their blood run cold. They ran. There was no shame in it, no pretense of bravery or rational thought. They ran through the forest, pursued by the sound of children's laughter and the soft padding of bare feet on earth. The trees seemed to reach for them, branches snagging their clothes, roots rising to trip their feet. And as they fled, they understood at last what they had stumbled into. This wasn't just a forest, it was a hunting ground, and they had never been anything but prey, lured here by their own arrogance and ignorance. The feral children were waiting, as they had always waited, as they would always wait. Patient and hungry and eternal, playing their games in the deep woods, leaving their dolls as warnings that no one ever heeded in time. And somewhere in that ancient forest, in the darkness between the trees, children's laughter echoes still, calling to those who would dare to venture too deep, who would dare to think themselves above the old fears, the old warnings, the old truths about what lives in the dark places of the world. The three of them made it out that day, though they never spoke of what they saw, what they heard, what they understood in those final moments of terror. But sometimes, on quiet nights, they hear it still. The soft sound of giggling, drifting through their dreams like smoke, reminding them that the feral children are always waiting, always watching, always hungry for new playmates to add to their eternal games. It started as the opportunity of a lifetime for Eli and Claire. They were two young botanists on a government-funded research trip into the rain-drenched forests of Oregon, their careers poised on the precipice of something extraordinary. Both had spent years studying unusual plant species, but nothing had prepared them for what they were about to encounter. They were tasked with studying an unusual species of moss that had been spreading at an abnormal rate, and initially, their academic excitement overshadowed any sense of foreboding. They'd heard whispers among other scientists about this living carpet, a moss that seemed to sprawl endlessly over forest floors, swallowing everything in its path. The whispers had started in hushed tones at conferences, spread through email chains, and finally reached their university department. They didn't know what it was, but the locals had a name for it: the skin of the earth. The name itself should have been their first warning. They arrived early in the morning, their SUV rattling to a stop on the forest's edge after a long drive through winding mountain roads. The trees stretched high above them, ancient sentinels so thick they blotted out the sun, leaving the forest below in a perpetual dim twilight. The air was thick with moisture, creating a perpetual mist that clung to everything it touched. Eli unfolded the hand-drawn map they'd been given, tracing their route into the deep woods, with fingers that trembled slightly from both excitement and an inexplicable nervousness. He and Claire exchanged a look, the weight of excitement and unease hanging in the air between them like the morning fog. Claire adjusted her backpack, filled with scientific equipment, specimen containers, microscopes, testing kits, and cameras. Her PhD work had focused on invasive species, but something about this assignment felt different. "Ready?" she asked, her voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that didn't quite reach her eyes. They set off, their boots crunching over the damp forest floor, each step releasing the rich scent of decomposing leaves and wet earth. The deeper they went, the more they noticed the strange, pervasive presence of the moss. At first it was barely noticeable, tiny patches clinging to stones, hugging the bases of tree trunks like shy children. But as they ventured farther, the patches became larger, more uniform, until it covered everything beneath their feet like a thick green carpet that seemed to pulse with its own life. The day passed quickly, their steps deliberate, careful not to damage any of the samples. Claire took note of the moss's unusual density and color, a dark, almost sickly shade of green that seemed to deepen as they moved deeper into the forest. It wasn't the vibrant emerald of healthy moss, but something darker, more sinister, a color that reminded her of gangrene and decay. The air was heavy and damp, filled with the thick, earthy scent that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. "Look at this," Eli said, bending down to examine a particularly thick patch of moss. His voice carried an edge of fascination tinged with something else, concern, perhaps, or fear. The moss clung to the ground in a dense mat, smooth and unbroken, unlike anything they'd seen in their years of research. "It's so thick there's no soil showing at all. The cellular structure must be incredible." Claire nodded, scribbling in her notebook with quick, nervous strokes. "It's like a carpet, almost like it's covering something." She paused, pen hovering over the paper. "Have you noticed there aren't any other plants growing through it? No seedlings, no smaller species, nothing breaking through." They spent hours taking samples, filling their bags with clippings and carefully collected specimens. Each sample seemed to resist their efforts, clinging to the earth with unusual tenacity. But as the day wore on, a strange unease began to settle over them, creeping into their minds like the moss itself crept over the forest floor. The deeper they ventured, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of wildlife, the birds, the insects, the rustle of small animals, had faded, leaving only the soft sound of their own footsteps and increasingly rapid breathing. Claire frowned, glancing around the silent woods, her scientific detachment beginning to crack. "It's so quiet. I don't like it. Where are all the animals? Even the insects are gone." Her voice seemed to be swallowed by the thick air, as if the forest itself was consuming the sound. Eli tried to laugh it off, but even he felt the weight of the silence pressing down on them like a physical force. "Maybe the moss scares everything off," he joked, though his voice sounded strange and hollow in the stillness. The words hung in the air, falling flat in the oppressive quiet. As the sun began to set, they decided to make camp, setting up their tent in a small clearing that seemed less overtaken by the moss. Eli cooked a quick meal on a portable stove, the quiet broken only by the soft hiss of the flame and the occasional clink of their utensils against metal plates. Claire sat beside him, staring at the moss that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, its surface almost glossy in the fading light. "I wonder how far it goes," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like it's swallowing the forest, consuming everything in its path." She shuddered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders despite the humid air. Eli shrugged, trying to maintain his scientific objectivity. "That's what we're here to find out, right? This could be revolutionary, a new species of moss with unprecedented growth patterns." But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by countless invisible eyes. But as they lay in their tent that night, a strange unease kept them both awake. The silence felt oppressive, almost unnatural, and the air was thick with the damp, earthy smell of moss that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. Eli shifted restlessly, listening to the faint rustling outside the tent. It was probably just the wind, he told himself. Probably nothing. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the image of the moss moving, creeping closer in the darkness. He finally drifted off to sleep, but his dreams were restless, filled with images of green tendrils creeping over his skin, wrapping around his limbs, pulling him down into the damp earth. In his dreams, he could feel the moss entering his mouth, his nose, filling his lungs with its ancient, deadly presence. They woke the next morning to a strange sight that made their blood run cold. The moss had crept closer to their tent in the night, forming a thick green ring around them. It was almost as if it were watching, waiting. The perfect circle couldn't be natural. It was too precise, too deliberate. Eli crouched down, running a finger along the edge of the moss, his scientific curiosity warring with growing terror. "It's grown so much overnight," he said, his voice tinged with a note of unease. "It's like it's moving. But that's impossible. Moss doesn't grow this fast. Claire nodded, her face pale in the dim morning light. We should document it, she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Maybe it's more aggressive than we thought. More alive. She fumbled with her camera, hands shaking as she took photographs of the perfect circle surrounding their tent. They spent the morning taking more samples, their unease growing with each passing hour. The moss seemed to pulse underfoot, almost as if it were alive, shifting and creeping closer with every step. It clung to their boots, tiny tendrils winding up their legs, so small they almost didn't notice until they felt the gentle tugging, like thousands of tiny hands trying to pull them down. By midday, they were both feeling the strain. The silence weighed heavily on them, the thick, damp air pressing down like a heavy blanket, making it difficult to breathe. The moss's scent had become overwhelming, a cloying mixture of decay and something else, something ancient and wrong. Eli glanced over at Claire, noticing the pale, drawn look on her face, the way her hands trembled as she collected samples. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet, like a shout in a cathedral. Claire shook her head, rubbing her arms as if to ward off a chill despite the humid air. "I don't know. I feel strange, like something's watching us, like we're not alone out here." She paused, looking around at the endless carpet of moss. "Have you noticed how it feels under our feet? Like it's responding to us?" Eli tried to laugh, but the sound came out hollow, forced. "Come on, it's just moss. It's not going to eat us." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were lies. The moss was everything but just moss. It was something else entirely, something that defied their scientific understanding. But deep down, he felt the same prickling unease. The moss was everywhere, creeping over the ground in an unbroken carpet, covering every rock, every root, every inch of soil. It was as if the forest itself was being swallowed whole, consumed by this ancient hungry thing that masqueraded as a simple plant. As the day wore on, the sense of dread grew, a dark, insidious feeling that clawed at the back of their minds. The moss seemed to be closing in around them, the circle growing tighter with each passing hour. By evening they decided to retreat to their tent, hoping that a night's rest would help clear their heads and restore their scientific objectivity. But sleep didn't come easily. Eli lay awake, listening to the faint rustling outside, the soft sound of something shifting, creeping closer. He tried to tell himself it was just the wind, but deep down, he knew better. The moss was moving. He could feel it, like a slow, creeping tide, inching closer with every passing moment. Besides him, Claire's breathing was rapid and shallow, betraying her own sleepless terror. Just before dawn, he finally drifted off, his dreams filled with images of green tendrils wrapping around him, pulling him down into the earth. In his dreams, he could hear voices, ancient whispers speaking of hunger and patience, of centuries spent waiting for the perfect moment to feed. He woke with a start, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The first thing he noticed was the smell, a thick, earthy scent that filled the air, almost suffocating in its intensity. He sat up, blinking in the dim light, and froze, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The moss was inside the tent. It had crept in during the night, a thick green carpet that covered the floor, reaching up along the walls like fingers. Tendrils of it had already begun to wind around their sleeping bags, creeping toward their exposed skin. Eli scrambled back, his heart racing, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. Claire was still asleep, her face pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes suggesting her rest had been anything but peaceful. He reached over, shaking her shoulder, his voice hoarse with fear. "Claire, wake up." She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around, her expression shifting from confusion to horror, as she took in the sight of the moss creeping over the tent floor, winding around their sleeping bags, reaching for them with an almost conscious purpose. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. What is this? This isn't possible. This can't be happening." They scrambled out of the tent, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape. Outside, the sight that greeted them was even worse, a nightmare made real in the early morning light. The moss had spread overnight, covering everything in a thick green carpet. The ground, the trees, even the rocks were coated in a dense pulsing mat that seemed to breathe, shifting and writhing like something alive. The forest they had entered just 2 days ago was gone, replaced by an alien landscape of living green that seemed to watch their every move with hungry attention. They tried to make their way back toward the car, but the moss was everywhere, clinging to their boots, winding around their ankles, dragging them down. It was like wading through quicksand, every step a struggle, the thick tendrils wrapping around their legs, pulling them deeper into the forest. They could feel it trying to work its way into their clothes, seeking bare skin with an almost conscious determination. The silence was deafening, the air thick with the stifling scent of moss and decay. Eli could feel his heart pounding, his mind racing, but there was no escape. The moss was relentless, closing in around them, swallowing everything in its path. Claire stumbled beside him, crying out as the tendrils wrapped around her legs, pulling her down. As they stumbled deeper into the forest, they began to realize the terrible truth. The moss wasn't just a plant. It was something alive, something ancient and hungry, a living, breathing entity that had been lying dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment to strike. And they, in their scientific curiosity, had walked right into its trap. And now it had them. Their cries for help were swallowed by the silence, their voices lost in the thick, damp air. They struggled against the moss, tearing at the tendrils, but it was no use. The moss was everywhere, covering them, pulling them down into the earth. They could feel it entering their mouths, their noses, filling their lungs with its thick, suffocating presence. In those final moments, as the moss wrapped around them, Claire reached for Eli's hand, their fingers intertwining one last time. They understood now, too late, what they had discovered. They were a part of the forest now, swallowed by the living skin of the earth, becoming one with the ancient hunger that dwelled beneath the ground. And there was no escape. 2 weeks later, another team of scientists would enter the forest, searching for the missing botanists. They would find no trace of Eli and Claire, only their equipment, their notes, and a vast carpet of moss that seemed to pulse with a satisfied hunger, waiting for its next meal. The locals had been right all along. It wasn't just moss. It was the skin of the earth. And it was always, always hungry. The plan was simple, the way all good camping trips start. 4 of us, Josh, Eric, Megan, and me, had been talking about getting away from it all for months. The idea was born out of a round of drinks, the usual chatter about how exhausted we were with city life, the hum of traffic, the constant buzz of people, the never-ending weight of concrete walls and windows. Eric, who'd grown up on family camping trips in Oregon, convinced us to try a remote spot he claimed was a hidden gem. No trails, no other campers, just us and the unmarked wild. We joked about it being our rite of passage as we packed the car that foggy Friday morning. Our bags were stocked with essentials, snacks, and a little too much beer. Eric's map wasn't from any guidebook. It was hand-drawn by one of his old friends who'd discovered the spot years ago. Quietest place on earth, his friend had called it. Almost unsettlingly quiet. At the time, we'd all shrugged it off. Quiet sounded like heaven. We drove for hours, the route turning from paved roads to gravel, and finally to little more than tire ruts winding into dense, damp woods. By the time we parked the car and started our hike, the excitement and adrenaline had taken over. We hiked deep, beneath towering trees that swallowed the light, laughing over jokes until we were too tired to laugh anymore. I didn't notice the strange quiet right away. The first evening, as the sun dipped and night began to settle, the silence started to feel thick, pressing down on us in a way I hadn't expected. The air was still, with no wind, no rustling of leaves. Not a single bird call or scurrying creature broke the silence. There was nothing, just us. Our voices felt muted, as if swallowed by the towering trees around us. I glanced over at Megan, usually the chatty one of our group. She was looking into the trees, her expression tight, her laughter barely making a ripple in the strange quiet. "It's eerie, right?" she whispered, eyes darting over her shoulder. "Like we're the only things out here." Eric laughed, but it was a little forced. "You city kids aren't used to nature, that's all." "No, I've camped before," she shot back, eyes scanning the tree line. "But it's never been this dead." We brushed it off as nerves, probably from the strange atmosphere, the late hour, the thickening shadows. That night, huddled around the fire, it felt like the flames were the only thing keeping the dark at bay. Our voices barely carried, each of us hesitating before speaking, laughter dying the moment it escaped our mouths. I was used to echoes in the city, the way sound bounced off buildings and seemed to bleed from every corner. But here, there was nothing, just silence, deep and whole, swallowing every sound. I felt the silence gnawing at me as I lay in my tent that night, staring into the pitch-black fabric above me. I couldn't even hear the breathing of the others, though we were practically on top of each other. It felt like each of us was in our own soundless bubble. I told myself it was just the forest, a weird quirk of nature. But the feeling of being swallowed stayed with me until I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came heavy. I woke feeling groggy and worn, as though I'd barely slept. We made breakfast in a stiff, uneasy silence, each of us too preoccupied with our own thoughts. Eric tried to lighten the mood, showing us how to identify different types of tree bark and spouting random facts about moss. Josh, always the jokester, tried to lighten the mood with tales of bear attacks and missing campers, but his humor fell flat, and even he couldn't shake the unease that clung to us. Around midday, we decided to push deeper into the forest, hoping a hike might shake off the strange tension. The underbrush was thick, and branches clawed at our legs as we struggled onward. Each step was a battle through thorny brambles and slippery rocks, but it was worth it to feel like explorers, cutting through what seemed to be untouched wilderness. That's when we found the clearing. It was a perfectly round, barren patch in the middle of the dense forest. The ground was hard-packed, dry dirt, surrounded by a precise ring of towering trees. There was no wildlife, no leaves or twigs scattered across the ground, just empty, lifeless earth, and trees that seemed to lean inward, almost as if they were watching. We stood in the clearing, a strange, heavy quiet settling over us. It felt wrong, like stepping into a forbidden place. Eric knelt down, pressing his fingers into the dirt. "No roots," he murmured, mostly to himself. "Not a single one." Josh rolled his eyes. "It's just a clearing, man. We should make it our second camp." But Megan was already backing away, her face pale. "I don't like it," she said. "Let's keep moving." We didn't argue. The clearing had set something dark and uneasy inside of each of us, a feeling we couldn't shake. It was like stepping into the quietest place on earth, the kind of silence that makes your ears ache. As we left, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle, as if something was watching us go. When we returned to camp that evening, the air was thicker than before, a heavy stillness pressing down on our shoulders. We sat around the fire, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I felt like I was on edge, like every muscle in my body was wound tight and ready to snap. That's when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, a light tapping from somewhere deep in the forest. I brushed it off, probably just a branch or a bird, but as the night wore on, the sound grew louder. It was a sharp, almost rhythmic click, like someone tapping on wood. I glanced over at Eric, who was staring into the trees, his face pale. "You hear it too?" he whispered. Before I could answer, Megan let out a startled yelp, her hand clamping over her mouth. She pointed into the shadows just beyond the firelight. We all turned, straining our eyes, but there was nothing there, just the dark shapes of trees and the oppressive silence. "It was someone," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper, "standing there, watching us." Josh let out a shaky laugh, but none of us were convinced. He threw another log on the fire, the flames flaring up, and we huddled closer, hoping the fire could keep whatever was out there at bay. But the tapping continued, closer now, echoing from all around us. The morning came slowly, the air heavy with exhaustion. I'd barely slept, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves jolting me awake. When I crawled out of my tent, I noticed immediately that Eric was gone. His gear was scattered outside his tent, but he was nowhere to be seen. We searched the area, our voices echoing into the trees and swallowed by the relentless quiet. We called for him until our throats were raw, combing the forest in a desperate search. Hours passed, and nothing. No sign of him, no footprints, nothing. It was as if he'd simply vanished. As dusk approached, we returned to camp, defeated and frightened. Josh tried to make a plan, talking about going for help, but his voice was shaky, his eyes darting around as if he expected Eric to step out of the shadows. That night, as we huddled around the fire, the clicking sound returned, louder and closer than before. Shadows flitted at the edge of the light, moving in a slow, silent dance. Josh clutched his flashlight, his hand shaking, but there was nowhere to run. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, each tree an identical, oppressive sentinel. The next morning, Josh was gone. His tent flap hung open, the ground around it undisturbed. Megan was almost catatonic, her face pale and drawn, muttering about the figures, about the things she'd seen moving in the trees. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was all in her head, but I knew deep down it wasn't. The forest had swallowed us whole, and it was only a matter of time before it took me too. The silence pressed in around us as the sun set, and I felt the weight of something watching, waiting. I don't know what happened to Eric and Josh, and I don't know what lies beyond the reach of the firelight. But I know, with a bone-deep certainty, that whatever is in these woods will not let us leave. As the last light slipped below the treetops, the weight of the silence grew unbearable. Megan and I huddled closer to the fire, desperate for its warmth, its light, anything to keep the darkness at bay. I could see her lips moving, whispering something to herself, maybe a prayer or a desperate plea. I tried to say something comforting, but my voice sounded strange, thin and hollow against the crushing quiet. The clicking sound started up again, echoing from deep within the trees. This time it was faster, more insistent, like something that was growing impatient. Megan's eyes widened as she looked toward the shadows, her hands clutching her knees so tightly her knuckles were white. "We can't stay here," I whispered, barely daring to breathe. "We have to keep moving." Megan shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "It's out there, whatever it is. It's waiting for us." A snap echoed from the darkness, a twig breaking, then another and another closer this time, until it sounded like footsteps crunching through the underbrush, advancing slowly, deliberately. My heart pounded, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, an impenetrable wall of darkness and silence. And then, just beyond the reach of the firelight, I saw it. A figure standing between the trees, motionless and impossibly tall. It was cloaked in shadows, its features obscured, but I could feel its eyes on us, watching with a cold, detached curiosity. It tilted its head as if studying us, and a low, raspy clicking sound echoed from deep within its throat. Megan let out a strangled cry, clutching my arm with a grip like iron. "It's him," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's been watching us since we got here." The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, each step punctuated by a sickening crunch of leaves and twigs. I stumbled back, pulling Megan with me, my mind racing, desperate for a plan, an escape, anything. But the figure just kept advancing, its hollow, clicking voice filling the air, drowning out even the crackling of the fire. I turned, dragging Megan with me, and we ran into the trees, branches clawing at our faces and arms as we stumbled through the darkness. Behind us, the clicking sound grew louder, echoing from every direction, like dozens of voices overlapping, whispering and murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. We stumbled over roots and rocks, barely able to see where we were going. My legs burned, every step a struggle, but the sound was relentless, closing in from all sides. Megan was crying, her voice ragged and breathless, but I didn't dare look back. I knew that if I stopped, even for a moment, it would catch us. The trees began to thin, the forest floor sloping downward. Ahead, I saw a glimmer of light through the trees, a break in the suffocating darkness. I pushed myself harder, my heart pounding as we burst into another clearing, gasping for breath. But this clearing was different. The ground was bare and hard, the same barren, lifeless earth we'd seen before. I felt a chill run down my spine as I looked around, realizing we'd somehow ended up back in the same clearing from before. The trees loomed around us, silent and watchful, their branches twisted and gnarled like reaching fingers. Megan's sobs turned to panicked gasps as she clung to me, her eyes wide and unblinking. "We're trapped," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It won't let us leave." The clicking sound was deafening now, echoing from the trees, surrounding us. I looked around wildly, searching for any sign of a path, an opening, anything that could lead us out. But there was nothing, just the endless circle of trees closing in like a cage. And then, out of the darkness, the figure appeared again. It stepped into the clearing, its eyes gleaming in the faint moonlight, hollow and empty. I felt its gaze pierce through me, cold and calculating, as it tilted its head, studying us with a strange, detached curiosity. I backed away, pulling Megan with me, but there was nowhere to go. The figure took another step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. The clicking sound echoed from deep within its throat, a guttural, inhuman noise that filled the air, drowning out even our own ragged breaths. Desperation clawed at me as I looked around, my mind racing. There had to be a way out, something we could do to escape. But the figure just kept advancing, its eyes never leaving us, its hollow, clicking voice growing louder with every step. I took a deep breath, summoning the last of my strength, and lunged forward, throwing myself at the figure. My hands met cold, empty air, and I stumbled, falling to my knees in the dirt. The figure was gone, vanished into the shadows as if it had never been there. But the clicking sound remained, echoing from all around us, filling the clearing with its cold, hollow rhythm. I looked around wildly, searching for any sign of the figure, but the trees were empty, the darkness unbroken. And then slowly, I realized the truth. The sound wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from the trees. The branches twisted and writhed, their bark cracking and splintering as they moved, reaching out like skeletal fingers. The trees themselves were alive, their hollow trunks filled with the same cold, calculating gaze as the figure. They watched us, their clicking voices echoing through the air, filling the clearing with a sense of suffocating dread. Megan let out a strangled scream, clutching my arm as the branches reached for us, their sharp, twisted limbs scraping against our skin. I pulled her close, my heart pounding as I looked around, desperately searching for an escape. But there was none. The trees closed in, their branches twisting and curling around us, trapping us in a cage of wood and shadows. The clicking sound grew louder, drowning out even our own screams, until all I could hear was the hollow, inhuman rhythm, echoing through the darkness. And then, as the branches closed in, I felt a strange, numb sense of calm wash over me. I looked into Megan's eyes, her face pale and terrified, and I realized with a sickening certainty that this was it. The forest had taken us, swallowed us whole, just as it had swallowed Josh and Eric. As the darkness closed in, the last thing I heard was the hollow, clicking voice, whispering from the depths of the trees. And then there was nothing. The three of them had planned this trip for months, poring over maps and equipment lists with the meticulous attention of people who knew the wilderness demanded respect. Ben, Lucas, and Vanessa weren't just casual weekend warriors. They were seasoned hikers with years of backcountry experience between them. They had tackled some of the most challenging trails in North America, from the rugged Appalachian Trail to the unforgiving terrain of Alaska. But something about this particular route in the Canadian Rockies called to them, a siren song of unexplored territory and pristine wilderness. They had discovered the trail on an obscure hiking forum, buried deep in a thread about off-grid adventures. The post itself had been peculiar, written by a user who had only ever made that single contribution before disappearing from the platform entirely. The description was minimal, almost cryptic. A few tantalizing sentences about hidden valleys untouched by human feet, ancient forests that held secrets in their shadows, and views that would change the way you see the world. But it was the final line that had lingered in their minds, an oddly specific warning that seemed out of place among the technical details. Stay close to the fire, and don't wander alone at night. Ben had made a show of laughing it off during their planning sessions, his booming voice filling his apartment as he read the warning aloud for the 100th time. Classic internet drama, he'd said, taking another sip of beer. Someone trying to make their hike sound more interesting than it actually was. But even as he dismissed it, the words had taken root in his mind, sprouting like seeds in dark soil. Vanessa, always the most pragmatic of the three, had added extra safety gear to their packs, just in case. A satellite phone, emergency flares, more first aid supplies than they'd normally carry. Better safe than sorry, she'd said, ignoring Lucas's playful teasing about her paranoia. Lucas, for his part, had been unusually quiet during the planning, spending hours researching the area's history and geological features, as if trying to uncover some hidden truth in the topographical maps. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold, the kind of autumn day that held winter in its breath. They loaded their gear into Ben's weathered Subaru, the trunk packed with the precise efficiency that came from years of practice. The drive from Calgary took them deep into the mountains, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to rough Forest Service tracks that tested the car's suspension. The mountains rose around them like ancient guardians, their peaks scratching at the pale blue sky. Clouds clung to the summits like torn cotton, casting shifting shadows across the valleys below. As they climbed higher, the radio signal began to fade, static consuming the music until Ben finally switched it off. The silence that followed felt heavy, meaningful somehow. They had to park several miles from their intended trailhead. The Forest Service road had been washed out earlier in the season, forcing them to add an unexpected leg to their journey. By the time they shouldered their packs and started hiking, the sun was already beginning its slow descent behind the jagged horizon. The forest closed around them like a living thing, the trees pressing close on all sides, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy that filtered the light into strange, shifting patterns. "We should make camp soon," Vanessa said, checking her watch for the third time in as many minutes. "I don't like the idea of setting up in the dark." Lucas nodded, his eyes scanning the dense undergrowth. "There's supposed to be a clearing about a half-mile ahead according to that forum post. Should be perfect for camping." They pushed on, their boots crunching on fallen leaves and broken twigs. The sound seemed unusually loud in the stillness of the forest. Ben found himself straining to hear the familiar sounds of wilderness. Bird calls, the rustle of small animals, the buzz of insects. But the woods were eerily quiet, as if holding their breath. When they finally found the clearing, the relief was palpable. It was almost exactly as described in the forum post, a roughly circular space about 40 feet across, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to lean inward, their branches creating a natural ceiling overhead. They wasted no time setting up camp, working with the practiced efficiency of experienced outdoors people. Their tents formed a rough triangle around what would be their fire pit, a formation they'd used countless times before. Vanessa got to work building the fire while Ben and Lucas gathered wood, staying within sight of the clearing. As darkness settled over the forest like a heavy blanket, they huddled around the growing flames, eating their dinner of dehydrated meals and trading the comfortable banter of old friends. But something felt off. The firelight seemed to stop abruptly at the edge of their camp, as if the darkness beyond was somehow thicker, more substantial than it should be. The usual nighttime sounds of the forest were still absent, creating a vacuum of silence that made their voices sound strange and hollow. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Lucas asked suddenly, his voice low. He was sitting with his back to the trees, but his posture was tense, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. Ben tried to laugh it off, but the sound caught in his throat. "City nerves," he said, but his eyes kept darting to the shadows beyond the firelight. "You know how it gets out here sometimes." That's when Lucas noticed it, a shape just beyond the reach of the flames, something that shouldn't have been there. "Hey," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you guys see that?" Ben and Vanessa turned, following his gaze. There, standing sentinel at the edge of their camp, was a figure that made their blood run cold. It was crude but deliberate, a doll fashioned from forest debris, standing about a foot tall. Its head was a dense cluster of dried grass, bound together in a way that suggested features without actually having any. The arms were twisted branches, arranged in an unnatural pose that seemed almost beckoning. Ben forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Some local kids must have too much time on their hands," he said, but they all knew how unlikely that was. They were miles from the nearest town, on a trail that hadn't seen regular use in years. Vanessa frowned, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate the figure. "The branches," she said slowly. "They're fresh, recently broken." She was right. The wood was still green. The leaves hadn't even begun to wilt. Lucas stood up, taking a step toward the figure, but Vanessa grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said sharply. Let's leave it alone." They tried to ignore it, to focus on their evening routine, but their conversation was forced, their laughter too loud in the pressing silence. As they prepared for bed, Vanessa's flashlight beam caught something else, another figure, identical to the first, standing on the opposite side of their camp. Her sharp intake of breath drew the others' attention. "There's another one," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "It wasn't there before. I swear it wasn't there before." The second figure was indeed identical to the first, down to the twisted pose of its branch arms. But something about it seemed different, more intentional somehow. Its blank face seemed to be turned directly toward their fire, toward them. They retreated to their tents earlier than usual that night. But sleep proved elusive. Ben lay awake for hours, listening to the unnatural silence of the forest, his mind racing with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with twisted shapes and reaching branches. The figures were gone the next morning, leaving no trace of their existence. They searched the area where they had stood but found nothing. No disturbed earth, no broken branches, nothing to suggest anything had been there at all. In the harsh light of day, it was easier to dismiss their fears, to laugh off their midnight paranoia. They broke camp efficiently, eager to put distance between themselves and the clearing. The day's hike took them deeper into the wilderness, the trail becoming less distinct with each passing mile. The forest seemed to press closer, the trees growing denser, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. When they made camp that evening, in another clearing that seemed almost too perfect, too deliberately placed, they tried to keep their spirits up. But as darkness fell, their fears from the previous night returned, and with good reason. The figures were back, and there were more of them now. 5 or 6 at least, arranged in a rough circle around their camp, their crude forms barely visible in the growing darkness. Each one was slightly different, unique in its construction, but all shared the same unsettling quality. They seemed to be watching, waiting. Vanessa's hands shook as she pointed them out, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are more of them." How are there more of them?" Lucas attempted a laugh, but it came out as more of a choke. "Maybe it's just animals," he suggested weakly. "Moving branches around, building nests or something." But they all knew better. The placement was too deliberate, the construction too precise. These weren't random arrangements of forest debris. They were made with purpose, with intent. They stayed close to the fire that evening, their conversation minimal, their attention focused on the dark spaces between the trees. The figures seemed to shift in the flickering firelight, their shadows dancing on the forest floor, creating the illusion of movement, just at the edge of vision. As their fire began to die down, Lucas stood abruptly. "We need more wood," he said, his voice tight with forced casualness. "I'll grab some." Vanessa's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with unexpected strength. "No," she said firmly. "Don't go out there. Not alone. Not after—" "It's just wood," he insisted, pulling away from her grasp. "The pile's right there, barely 20 feet away. I'll be fine." Before either of them could protest further, he stepped beyond the circle of firelight. They watched his figure fade into the darkness, the sound of his footsteps seeming unnaturally loud in the silence. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows over the stick figures that stood their silent vigil. Vanessa was about to call out when they heard it. Movement in the darkness, the soft crunch of footsteps on fallen leaves. But something was wrong. The rhythm was off, too measured, too deliberate to be human. A figure emerged from the darkness, but it wasn't Lucas. It was one of the stick dolls, but impossibly, horrifyingly large, standing 7 or 8 feet tall, its twisted limbs moving with an awful fluidity that defied their wooden nature. Vanessa's scream caught in her throat as the figure took another step forward, its movement accompanied by the creaking of wood and the rustle of dead leaves. Its head, now a massive crown of bound grass and twigs, seemed to study them with an alien intelligence. Ben grabbed Vanessa's arm, yanking her to her feet. "Run!" he hissed, his voice thick with terror. "Run now!" They plunged into the darkness, their headlamps bouncing wildly as they crashed through the undergrowth. The figures were everywhere, their twisted forms visible in brief, horrifying glimpses, standing between trees, reaching with their branch arms, their grass heads turning to follow their desperate flight. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs trembled, the forest a blur of shadows and reaching branches. When they finally burst into another clearing, they nearly collapsed from exhaustion. And there, in the center of the space, stood Lucas, or what had once been Lucas. He was standing perfectly still, his back toward them, arms raised in a pose that mirrored the stick figures. Ben took a hesitant step forward, his voice breaking. "Lucas." But as they drew closer, the horrible truth became clear. Lucas wasn't standing. He was transformed. Vines and branches had wrapped around his body, becoming part of him. His skin had taken on the texture of bark, his fingers elongated into twisted twigs. His eyes, when they finally saw them, were empty holes filled with dried grass. Vanessa's scream echoed through the forest, but there was no one to hear it. The figures were closing in, their wooden limbs creaking, their grass heads rustling with an awful whispered sound. They were surrounded, trapped in this endless forest that had claimed their friend, that wanted to claim them too. As the twisted forms drew closer, Ben and Vanessa huddled together, watching in horror as more figures emerged from the darkness. They were everywhere now, an army of the Hollow Ones, come to make them part of their eternal, silent vigil. In the distance, a fire flickered and died, its light swallowed by the endless dark of the forest. And in that darkness, two more figures joined the Hollow Ones, their grass-filled eyes staring out at nothing, their wooden limbs reaching forever toward the sky. The warning had been clear. Stay close to the fire, and don't wander alone at night. But in these woods, in this place of twisted things and silent watchers, even the fire couldn't save you from becoming one of the Hollow Ones. The plan had been to escape from everything, the city, the noise, the endless distractions, and just be together. Emma and Kyle had spent weeks planning their camping trip, choosing the most secluded spot they could find in the Appalachian Mountains. The preparation had been meticulous. Emma had researched trail conditions, weather patterns, and even lunar cycles to ensure their experience would be perfect. Kyle, ever the practical one, had focused on gathering the essential gear, carefully weighing each item to ensure they packed light without sacrificing safety. They'd chosen early October, when the crowds would be thin and the weather still mild. The autumn colors were just beginning to paint the mountainsides in brilliant hues of red and gold, creating a stunning backdrop for their adventure. They'd packed light, bringing only the essentials: a compact two-person tent, sleeping bags rated for the mountain chill, basic cooking equipment, and enough food for 5 days in the wilderness. The drive had taken longer than expected, winding through increasingly remote mountain roads, until even their GPS signal became unreliable. They'd driven for hours until they reached a trailhead that wasn't even marked on the map, exactly what they'd been looking for. From there, they hiked deep into the forest, off-trail, eager to be alone in the thick wilderness. Emma remembered the way Kyle's eyes had lit up when they first stepped onto the barely visible path, his whole body seeming to come alive with excitement. The first night was perfect, or at least it had seemed that way at first. They found a small clearing near a trickling creek, the sound of running water creating a peaceful backdrop to their camp. The spot was ideal: level ground for their tent, plenty of dry wood for a fire, and a natural rock formation that would help block the wind. They set up their small tent with practiced efficiency, working together in the comfortable silence of long-term partners who knew each other's movements by heart. As darkness fell, they lit a campfire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. They roasted marshmallows, laughing as they competed to achieve the perfect golden brown color, Kyle's inevitably catching fire while Emma's turned out picture perfect. They pointed out constellations in the clear night sky, their voices hushed in reverence of the vast expanse above them. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of stars, more visible here than they'd ever seen it before. But even that first night, there was an uneasy stillness that seemed to penetrate the peaceful scene. Emma noticed it first, though she tried to ignore it. The way the air seemed heavy, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The strange absence of typical forest sounds. No owls calling, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. She brushed it off, telling herself it was just her imagination, the natural anxiety of being so far from civilization. She fell asleep curled up against Kyle, his warmth comforting her as the darkness pressed in. But her dreams were uneasy, filled with shadowy figures that seemed to dance just at the edge of her vision. It was the second night when things started to change, when the forest began to reveal its true nature. The day had been pleasant enough. They'd explored the area around their camp, discovering a small waterfall upstream and several interesting rock formations. Kyle had even found what looked like old stone foundations, suggesting they weren't the first people to seek solitude in these woods. But something about those crumbling stones had unsettled Emma, though she couldn't explain why. They seemed too angular, too purposeful, as if they'd been placed with some intent that she couldn't quite grasp. They were sitting around the campfire again as evening fell, talking in hushed tones about their discoveries, when Emma felt it, a sensation that prickled her skin, raising goosebumps along her arms despite the warmth of the fire. It was the feeling of being watched, an ancient instinct that humans never quite lose. The awareness that somewhere in the darkness, eyes were fixed upon them. She glanced over her shoulder, peering into the dense shadows just beyond the reach of the firelight. But there was nothing there. Nothing she could see, at least. She forced a laugh, trying to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind like a hungry thing. "Do you feel that?" she whispered to Kyle, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. She noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. Kyle looked up from the fire, frowning. The flickering flames cast strange shadows across his face, making him look older, more worried than she'd ever seen him. "Feel what?" I don't know. Like we're not alone." The words sounded silly as soon as she said them, like something from a cheap horror movie. But they were the only way she could describe the crawling sensation along her spine. He chuckled, reaching over to squeeze her hand, but she noticed the laugh didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're miles from anyone, Em. It's just us." His voice carried a forced casualness that told her he might be feeling it too, even if he wouldn't admit it. She tried to smile, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger as the night deepened around them. As the fire crackled, she couldn't shake the sense that there were eyes on them, watching from somewhere deep in the trees. Every time she looked, she saw nothing, just the dark shapes of the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. But somehow that made it worse. The darkness seemed to shift and move in ways that darkness shouldn't, as if it were alive, conscious, hungry. They crawled into the tent after the fire died down, Emma still feeling unsettled. She lay beside Kyle, staring at the fabric of the tent, watching the way the moonlight created strange patterns on the nylon surface. She could feel her heartbeat slow as she tried to relax, focusing on Kyle's steady breathing beside her. She could hear the soft rustling of leaves outside, the gentle creak of branches shifting in the wind. Normal sounds, she told herself, natural sounds. And then, as she began to drift off, she heard something else. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. But these weren't the random, scurrying steps of a small animal. These were deliberate, measured, almost human in their rhythm, but not quite right. There was something off about the timing, as if whatever was making them had to think about each step, had to remember how to walk. Her eyes flew open, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Kyle must be able to hear it. She lay completely still, straining to hear, but the sound was gone, replaced by the soft whisper of the wind. She told herself it was nothing, just her mind playing tricks, but the feeling of dread settled over her, heavy and suffocating. She wanted to wake Kyle, to tell him what she'd heard, but something stopped her. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the irrational fear that speaking about it would somehow make it more real. Hours later, she finally drifted off, though her sleep was restless, filled with strange dreams of shadows moving through the trees, hollow eyes watching from the darkness. In her dreams, the trees whispered to each other in voices that were almost, but not quite, human. They spoke of hunger and patience, of waiting and watching, of the joy of the hunt. When she woke the next morning, she barely remembered the dreams, though the sense of unease remained, clinging to her like morning dew. She brushed it off, trying to focus on enjoying the day with Kyle. They hiked along the creek, exploring the thick, overgrown forest, and for a while, she almost managed to forget the feeling that had haunted her the night before. The sunlight filtering through the canopy above made everything seem less threatening, more natural. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the dread crept back, a cold, gnawing fear that settled in her stomach as they returned to their camp. They lit the fire again, but the flame seemed smaller tonight, weaker, the light barely penetrating the encroaching darkness. The shadows seemed deeper, more substantial, as if they were slowly consuming the space around them. Emma found herself glancing over her shoulder every few minutes, her gaze drawn to the thick shadows that pressed in around them. She could feel it, something lurking just beyond the light, something watching, waiting. The feeling was stronger now, more urgent, as if whatever had been observing them had grown bolder, more certain of its purpose. Kyle noticed her unease, reaching over to squeeze her hand. His palm was sweaty, betraying his own nervousness. "Hey, you okay?" She forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, I'm fine. I don't know. It's probably just nerves." But they both knew it was more than that. Something had changed in the forest, or perhaps they were just finally noticing what had been there all along. They sat in silence, the fire crackling softly, the darkness deepening around them. The stars were hidden tonight, the sky obscured by clouds that had rolled in during the afternoon. The darkness felt absolute, pressing in from all sides like a living thing. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Emma saw it. A faint glint of light, like a reflection, shining from somewhere deep in the trees. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest, and turned to look, but the light was gone. She stared into the darkness, barely daring to breathe, and then it appeared again, a pair of eyes reflecting the firelight, watching them from the shadows. They weren't animal eyes. They were too knowing, too intelligent. They held a cold, calculating awareness that sent chills down her spine. Her breath caught in her throat as she nudged Kyle, her hand shaking. "Do you see that?" He turned, squinting into the darkness. For a moment there was nothing, just the thick wall of trees. And then he saw it too. A glint of light, two eyes staring back at them, unblinking. She felt him stiffen beside her, his body going rigid with fear. Kyle's face paled, and he instinctively moved closer to her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "Probably just an animal," he whispered, though his voice was tight with fear. "A deer or something." But they both knew he was lying to himself, trying to find a rational explanation for something that defied rationality. Emma shook her head, her eyes fixed on the pair of eyes in the darkness. They were too high off the ground, too still, watching them with a cold, unnatural intensity. She felt her skin prickle with fear, a cold sweat breaking out along her spine. The eyes seemed to glow with their own inner light now, a pale, greenish luminescence that had nothing to do with the reflected firelight. The eyes disappeared, vanishing into the shadows, and she let out a shaky breath, relief flooding over her. But then, a moment later, they reappeared, closer this time, as if whatever was watching them had moved in silence, inching closer to the firelight. The movement was impossible. No living thing could move that quietly through the dense underbrush. Yet somehow, it had. Emma's grip on Kyle's arm tightened, her nails digging into his skin. "Kyle, I don't think we're alone." The words came out in a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might draw the attention of whatever was watching them, might make it move closer still. He nodded, his face pale. They both knew it wasn't an animal. Animals didn't watch people like that, didn't creep closer in the shadows, didn't stare with that hollow, unblinking gaze. Whatever was out there was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in their rational modern world. They sat in silence, their bodies tense, every nerve on edge. The eyes moved again, disappearing and reappearing closer, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern around the edge of the firelight. It was as if it was testing them, gauging their reactions, waiting for the right moment. Emma could feel its hunger now, an ancient, patient hunger that had waited countless years for just this moment. Emma felt a wave of nausea wash over her, her body trembling with fear. She wanted to run, to get as far away from those eyes as possible. But the darkness pressed in from all sides, trapping them, holding them in place. She knew instinctively that running would be useless. Whatever was out there knew these woods far better than they did, had probably been here since before there were words for what it was. And then, without warning, the eyes vanished, swallowed by the shadows. Emma and Kyle sat frozen, barely daring to breathe, their eyes darting around the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. The forest was silent, the only sound the faint crackle of the dying fire. But the feeling of being watched remained, a heavy, oppressive presence that weighed down on them, filling the air with a sense of suffocating dread. They crawled into the tent, clutching each other in the darkness, their bodies tense, every sound amplified by the silence. Emma lay awake for hours, her heart pounding, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. She thought about the old stone foundations they'd found, wondered about the people who had built them, wondered if they too had seen those eyes in the darkness. Finally, exhaustion claimed her, pulling her down into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of moving shadows and hungry eyes. She woke in the early hours of the morning, the first light of dawn filtering through the trees. The tent felt wrong, empty. Kyle was gone. She sat up, her heart pounding, her gaze darting around the empty tent. His sleeping bag was still there, twisted and empty, as if he'd been pulled from it. Panic surged through her as she stumbled outside, calling his name, her voice hoarse with fear. The morning air was thick with mist, turning the forest into a maze of ghostly shapes. There was no answer, just the silent forest stretching out before her, endless and indifferent. The trees seemed to watch her with ancient, patient malice, as if they had always known this moment would come. She searched the camp, her hands shaking, her mind racing. His gear was gone, his footprints leading away from the camp, deeper into the forest. But something about the tracks was wrong. They were too straight, too purposeful, as if he'd been pulled along by some irresistible force. It was as if he'd simply walked off in the night, drawn into the shadows by whatever had been watching them. Emma felt a cold dread settle over her, her mind struggling to comprehend what had happened. She wanted to believe he'd gone for help, or maybe just for a morning hike, but deep down she knew the truth. The forest had taken him, just as it had probably taken others before him, just as it would take others in the future. She spent the day searching, her voice echoing through the trees, her pleas swallowed by the silence. But there was no sign of him, no trace of his presence beyond those single line of tracks that ended abruptly in a small clearing, as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. It was as if he'd been swallowed whole, lost to the shadows that lurked just beyond the firelight. As night fell, she huddled by the fire, her body trembling with fear. She could feel the eyes watching her again, moving in the darkness, inching closer with every passing moment. She wanted to scream, to run, but the shadows held her in place, trapping her, suffocating her. She understood now that this had always been inevitable, that from the moment they'd stepped into these woods, they'd been marked. In those final moments, as the eyes moved closer, she understood something else too. The forest was alive, a living, breathing entity that had been watching them since the moment they'd arrived, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was ancient and patient, and it had been hungry for so very long. And now, as the darkness closed in around her, she realized there was no escape. There never had been. The forest had called them here, had drawn them in with its promise of solitude and peace, only to reveal its true nature when it was too late. The eyes were the last thing she saw, moving closer, closer, until they filled her entire world with their pale, hungry light. And then, like Kyle, like all the others who had come before, she was gone, becoming just another story that the forest would keep. Another secret whispered by the wind through ancient trees that had learned to hunt. They found their abandoned campsite weeks later, everything exactly as they'd left it, untouched by animals or weather. But of Emma and Kyle themselves, there was no trace. They had vanished completely, as if the forest had simply reached out and plucked them from the world of the living, adding them to its eternal hungry darkness. And deep in the woods, in the gathering dusk, a pair of eyes still watches, waiting for the next visitors who will venture too far from the marked trails, seeking solitude in places where they were never meant to be. The trip was supposed to be about reconnecting. Life had taken the three of them in different directions, and their mother had pushed them to spend time together again. "Before you're all old men," she'd said with a laugh, her eyes crinkling at the corners in that familiar way that always made them feel like children again. The truth was, they hadn't all been in the same room since their father's funeral 2 years ago, and the weight of that absence still hung heavy between them. So Aaron, the oldest, organized the whole thing, a weekend at an isolated lake deep in Alaska, where they could fish, share old stories, and escape the chaos of work and family life. The planning had taken months. Aaron had pored over maps, researched fishing spots, and carefully selected gear for the trip. He'd chosen Lake Whisper, a remote body of water that locals rarely visited, nestled deep in the Alaskan wilderness. The isolation appealed to him. No cell service, no distractions. Just 3 brothers and the chance to rebuild what time had slowly eroded. The drive was brutal, the roads rough and winding through dense forests that seemed to swallow their SUV whole. Jake sat in the passenger seat, methodically checking their coordinates every few miles, while Tommy dozed in the back, his head lolling against the window. By the time they reached the narrow path that led to the lake, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, painting the sky in deep purples and blues that made the wilderness seem even more vast and untamed. They hiked in silence, lugging their gear through the undergrowth. Each step seemed to take them further from civilization, deeper into a world that felt increasingly alien. Aaron noticed how Tommy's hands kept tightening on his backpack straps, how Jake's eyes darted between the trees. They were city boys now, he realized, no longer the fearless kids who'd spent summers camping with their father. Aaron broke the quiet as they finally caught sight of the lake, its dark surface reflecting the last light of day like a mirror stretched across the earth. "Perfect, right?" he said, flashing a grin that felt more confident than he actually was. "Just us and the water." Jake, the middle brother, shrugged, looking around at the dense, silent forest that surrounded the lake. His medical practice had kept him in Seattle for the past decade, and it showed in the way he carried himself. Too stiff, too cautious. "Yeah, nothing but us and the bears," he said, attempting humor, but failing to hide the nervousness in his voice. They chuckled, though their laughter seemed oddly hollow in the stillness, as if the very air around them was absorbing the sound. The lake stretched out before them, vast and ancient, its surface eerily calm. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and moss, and something else, something older, deeper, that none of them could quite identify. Aaron wasted no time setting up the campsite, falling back into the routines their father had drilled into them years ago. Tommy helped with the tents while Jake gathered firewood, though Aaron noticed how his younger brothers kept glancing at the lake, as if drawn to its dark surface by some invisible force. By the time they were settled, night had fallen like a heavy curtain over the wilderness, and a thick mist was creeping in from the lake, drifting across the water in low, pale wisps that seemed to move with an almost conscious purpose. They sat around the fire, their voices hushed, the weight of the wilderness pressing down on them like a physical presence. The conversation drifted to memories, fishing trips with their father, summer afternoons spent on the dock behind their grandmother's house, the time Tommy fell out of the rowboat and Jake dove in to save him. But something felt off about the reminiscing, as if they were performing for an unseen audience rather than truly connecting. As they talked, a strange sound drifted through the stillness, a faint, raspy whisper carrying from somewhere near the water. It was barely audible at first, like the sound of wind through dead leaves. But there was something distinctly wrong about it, something that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. They paused, listening, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only the quiet crackle of the fire and their own suddenly rapid breathing. "Did you guys hear that?" asked Tommy, the youngest. His voice was barely a whisper, his eyes fixed on the dark surface of the lake. At 32, he was still the baby of the family, the one they all felt the need to protect, even now. Aaron chuckled, though there was a nervous edge to it that he couldn't quite hide. "It's just the wind, kid. Nothing out here but us." The words felt hollow, even as he spoke them, a weak attempt at maintaining the illusion of control. But Jake didn't look convinced. He stared out at the lake, his expression tense, as if he were searching for something hidden in the shadows. His medical training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct was screaming that something was wrong. Aaron clapped him on the shoulder, laughing it off, and they went back to talking, their voices a little louder, a little more forced than before, as if they could drown out the unnatural silence that seemed to be closing in around them. As the night wore on, the whispers returned. They drifted across the lake like pieces of a broken conversation, soft and indistinct, like a faint murmur of voices just beyond the edge of hearing. Sometimes they seemed to form words, fragments of sentences that almost made sense before dissolving back into meaningless sound. The brothers exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter fading, replaced by a growing sense of unease that seemed to seep into their bones. Aaron tried to brush it off, insisting it was just the wind, just their imaginations playing tricks in the darkness. But deep down, they all felt it. That strange, unsettling feeling that something was watching them, that they were not alone in this seemingly empty wilderness. The feeling grew stronger with each passing hour, until the very air seemed charged with an electric tension that made their skin crawl. They retreated to their tents eventually, though none of them slept well. Aaron lay awake, listening to the soft rustling of the trees, the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Every now and then, he thought he heard a whisper, a faint, raspy voice calling his name, drifting through the darkness like a ghostly breath. He told himself it was nothing, just the wind, just his mind playing tricks, but the words seemed too deliberate, too focused, as if something out there knew exactly who he was and what it wanted from him. By morning, he'd convinced himself it was nothing, just his imagination playing tricks, the result of too many horror movies and too little sleep. But when he crawled out of his tent, he found Jake and Tommy sitting by the water, their faces pale, their eyes dark with exhaustion. They looked like they'd aged years overnight, the shadows under their eyes deep and bruise-like. "Did you hear it too?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid of being overheard. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched a cup of instant coffee, the steam rising in thin wisps that reminded Aaron too much of the mist that had crept across the lake the night before. Aaron nodded, glancing out at the lake. The water was still, dark and silent, its surface smooth and undisturbed. But the unease lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on them, filling the air with a strange electric tension that made it hard to breathe. The morning light should have made things better, should have chased away the shadows and the fear, but somehow it only made everything seem more wrong, more artificial, as if they were looking at a painting of a lake rather than the real thing. They spent the day fishing, though none of them caught much. The lake seemed empty, lifeless, the water dark and still, as if something was lurking just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. They tried to make conversation, to act normal, but their words felt forced and hollow, like actors reading from a script they didn't quite understand. The whispers returned as the sun began to set, drifting through the mist that clung to the water, carrying with them a strange, insistent pull that seemed to tug at something deep inside their minds. As they sat around the fire that night, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't just random sounds anymore. They were voices, soft and raspy, calling to them, whispering their names, filling their minds with a strange, seductive lure that was becoming harder and harder to resist. The voices seemed to know things, secrets they'd never told anyone, memories they'd tried to forget. Tommy was the first to break. He stood suddenly, staring out at the lake, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide and empty. There was something wrong with his expression, something vacant and hungry that made him look like a stranger wearing his brother's face. I think there's someone out there," he murmured, his voice distant, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "I need to see. I need to understand." Aaron reached out, grabbing his arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. "Tommy, it's just the wind. Don't go near the water." But even as he spoke, he could feel it too. That pull, that whispered promise of something vast and ancient and terrible waiting just beneath the surface. But Tommy shook him off, his gaze fixed on the lake, his body tense, as if he were being pulled by an invisible force. Aaron tried to stop him, but Tommy slipped free, stumbling toward the water, his steps slow and deliberate, like a sleepwalker in the grip of a dream he couldn't wake from. Jake grabbed Aaron's shoulder, his voice shaking. "Let him go. Maybe he just needs some air." But there was something wrong with Jake's voice too. Something hollow and distant that suggested he was already half gone himself, already listening to whatever was calling from the depths. They watched as Tommy walked to the water's edge, his reflection shimmering in the dark, still surfaced like a ghost. He knelt, his hands dipping into the icy water, his face pale and expressionless. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with a strange, hypnotic rhythm, wrapping around them like a cold, suffocating blanket. Aaron felt his pulse quicken, his heart pounding as he watched Tommy, his mind racing with a strange, growing fear that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primitive inside him. And then, without warning, Tommy slipped beneath the surface. There was no splash, no struggle, no cry for help. He simply went under, as if the lake had reached up and pulled him in, as if he had never been solid at all, but merely a reflection that had finally returned to its source. Aaron and Jake ran to the water's edge, their hands clawing at the empty air where Tommy had been. But there was nothing, no sign of him, no ripple in the water, just the still, dark surface, stretching out endlessly before them like a mirror to another world. The water was impossibly cold when they reached in, so cold it burned, and somewhere in the depths, they could hear singing, a strange, haunting melody that made their thoughts blur and fade. Aaron screamed his brother's name, his voice echoing through the silence, but the lake remained still, unmoved, its dark depths swallowing his cries like it had swallowed Tommy. They spent hours searching, their voices hoarse, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and cold. But there was no trace of Tommy, no sign of what had happened to him. It was as if he'd been swallowed whole, pulled into the lake by an invisible hand that had been waiting all along. By dawn, they were both slumped on the shore, staring out at the lake in numb silence. The whispers had faded with the first light, leaving only a heavy, oppressive silence, pressing down on them like a weight. But something had changed during the night. The lake seemed bigger somehow, deeper, as if Tommy's disappearance had opened up some vast, empty space that was slowly pulling everything else in. They sat in silence for hours, their minds numb, their bodies cold and stiff. The sun rose higher, casting a pale, sickly light over the lake, but the darkness remained, lingering just beneath the surface, a silent reminder of what they'd lost. And then, as they sat in silence, they heard it, the faint, raspy sound of Tommy's voice, drifting up from the depths, calling their names, whispering secrets in a language they couldn't understand but somehow knew they'd always known. Jake's face went pale, his eyes wide with terror as he stood, his gaze fixed on the water. "It's him," he whispered, his voice trembling. "He's calling us. He wants us to join him." There was something wrong with his eyes now, something dark and hungry that made him look less and less like himself with each passing moment. Aaron grabbed his arm, his grip tight, his voice fierce. "It's not him. It's the lake, Jake. It's trying to pull us in. We have to leave now before it's too late." But even as he spoke, he could feel it too. That pull, that whispered promise of something vast and ancient and terrible waiting just beneath the surface. Something that had always been waiting. Something that had called them here for this very purpose. But Jake didn't seem to hear him. He took a step toward the water, his face pale, his eyes wide and empty. Aaron shouted, grabbing him, dragging him back. But Jake fought him, his movements frantic, desperate, like a man possessed. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with promises and secrets and terrible, wonderful truths. "I need to go to him," Jake whispered, his voice a hollow, haunted echo of itself. "He's waiting for me. They're all waiting for me." And Aaron knew, with a terrible certainty, that Jake wasn't just talking about Tommy anymore. Aaron held him back, his heart pounding, his mind racing with fear. But deep down, he felt it too. A strange, insistent pull, a whispering voice that called to him, filling his mind with visions of the lake, of the dark, endless depths waiting just beneath the surface. The water seemed to move now, to ripple and shift with a life of its own, and in its depths, he thought he could see faces, not just Tommy's, but others, countless others, all calling, all waiting. He dragged Jake back to the camp, forcing him to sit, trying to shake the strange trance that had settled over him. But the whispers remained, a soft, insistent murmur that filled the air, wrapping around them like a cold, suffocating fog. They spoke of secrets now, of truths hidden in the depths, of a world beneath the water where everything made sense, where everything was connected, where they could all be together again, forever. By the time night fell, Aaron was the only one left by the fire. Jake had disappeared, slipping away in the early hours, leaving only the faint outline of his footsteps in the sand, leading toward the lake like a path to salvation. Aaron had tried to stop him, had screamed and fought and begged, but in the end, the lake's call had been too strong, its promises too sweet to resist. Now, as he sat alone, the whispers filled his mind, their soft, insistent rhythm lulling him into a strange, dreamlike state. He could see Tommy and Jake in the water, their faces pale, their eyes wide and empty, waiting for him, calling his name, their voices soft and hollow like wind through dead leaves. They weren't alone anymore. There were others with them, countless others, all calling, all waiting, all promising that everything would make sense if he just joined them, if he just let go and slipped beneath the surface. He felt his body move, his legs carrying him toward the water, his mind numb, his heart still. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind, his body, his soul, until there was nothing left but the lake, the dark, endless depths that stretched out before him like a gateway to another world. The water was warm now, welcoming, and as he waded deeper, he could hear them all calling to him, promising him peace, promising him understanding, promising him an end to the loneliness and fear that had haunted him all his life. And as he slipped beneath the surface, the last thing he heard was the soft, raspy sound of his brothers' voices, calling to him from the darkness, welcoming him home to the depths where they would all be together, forever, in the endless, ancient silence of the lake. In the morning, the lake was still again, its surface smooth and undisturbed. The campsite stood empty, 3 tents flapping gently in the breeze, waiting for occupants who would never return. And beneath the surface, in the dark, endless depths, 3 brothers floated in the ancient silence, their faces peaceful, their eyes empty, their voices joining the whispers that would call to others, drawing them down, down, down into the darkness where they would all be together, forever, in the cold embrace of the water's edge.